Reading allows me to escape every day.
Hello and welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for people who know that the mere presence of a book, even if you haven't read it, exudes comfort. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. Now, Michaela, you've been chatting to an Australian writer who is a household name.
He certainly is. If you haven't already met him, I'm going to introduce you to an author, but also a really lovely man, Markus Zusak. He's most famous for The Book Thief. It's a book that sold so many copies, he probably could have afforded to have retired and never written another word, but he's gone on to write a few. And I'm going to talk to him about writing his seventh book and what was his first memoir, 3 Wild Dogs and the Truth.
What role do the wild dogs play in his life if it's a memoir?
It's the story of his family's love affair with 3 dogs. They were dogs that he got from the pound, and I have to say they're probably the type of dog that I would find very annoying or even quite scary in a dog park. I had a small, fluffy, annoying dog when I was about 19 that was attacked by a pit bull in my own backyard and was killed before my eyes. So I can be a little bit sort of touchy about dogs that are a bit wild. But I have to say, in this book is a love story, and it did warm my heart, even though they were a bit naughty. It was a lovely insight into this family's life and their passion for complicated animals.
And speaking of family life, I revisited a classic from generations of women's childhoods, Little Women. Well, I'm sure you remember it too, that cosy, comforting, sometimes tear-jerking book, written in 1868 at the height of the American Civil War. So today I asked our favourite book reviewers and literary academics, Louisa Bennett and Kylie Cardell, to discuss the book that never really goes away.
It doesn't, I know what you mean.
The most recent version, I don't know if I tried to watch this on the plane actually, a 2019 film by Greta Gerwig. She went on to make Barbie, and she's a director who always has a feminist take on things. I have to say I turned it off after a while. I got a bit, it was a little bit too soft focus and I probably didn't watch enough. Anyway, the thing about Little Women is it a feminist book that encourages girls to follow their dreams, or is it about looking after men and doing needlework by the fire? So at least one of our reviewers wasn't buying the feminist theory.
When I think of Little Women, I picture it like a pretty little snow globe. And they're living in this beautiful little bubble with the snow falling around, and everything else is beyond the globe. And horrible things like slavery, they don't happen in this nice little pristine bubble.
Okay, so on to 3 Wild Dogs and the Truth. I met with Sydney-based Markus Zusak on the Adelaide leg of his book tour in October, and I began by asking how touring now as a famous author has differed from those early days when he was first a writer.
I've had the luckiest life because of books and getting to see different parts of the world. And I just remind myself never to take that as a given. And I always say to people that I can't do the Marlon Brando speech from On the Waterfront of I never got my shot at the title. It's sort of I've had my shot at a successful writing career and then some. I've been hugely lucky, and that includes being here talking to you. I mean, you put a book out, and no one cares at the beginning, and even now, I just remind myself all the time that people don't have to care. It's not a rule that because you've written a book, everyone has to care about you. You sometimes have to go out and fight for it a little bit. Or you just have to go, okay, put that out in the world, and there's a point where the book has to do its own work.
3 Wild Dogs and the Truth it's an unusual memoir. So on tour, what are you finding the audiences are connecting with most about this story?
As far as it being unusual, I'm not really totally aware of that. All I know is what I had to do, and I think I'm very clear about that when I sit down to write, is I know I'm looking for something, and so what happens is I'll start it because we had these 3 dogs. Well, we have 1 now, but we had 2 at the same time, and we just had a pretty gnarly but beautiful, tragic, glorious time with these dogs. And I think I love the idea that we live a life that has these intense moments in them. And people say, oh, was that part hard to write about? Like when those 2 dogs died, was that hard to write? And I say, I loved writing about that because everything in this book brought them near again, even though they're near me always anyway. I think people so far are more just responding to me talking about that and just appreciating or understanding real love as it's not always about the good times. I think there's a small part in all of us where we understand that chaos is going to intrude in our lives, and sometimes we will even seek it out because we know that that's where our best stories are and it's where our true heart is.
Well, getting 3 wild dogs really was no accident, was it? You do seek out those challenging and exciting and rewarding personalities in your animals, and Bijou, the cat, and Brutus. I mean, none of them are quiet animals.
What the hell were we thinking? It's sort of, and I know I use that line towards not at the very end of the book, but when we bring out, we've just had a household with no animals in it for 3 months, and I talk about this idea that what our household was left with were these arguing humans,
and a lot of hair, a lot of dog hair.
That's like I say, our vacuum cleaner could have gone to the Bahamas. It's one of those things, but there was a slight emptiness where we were ready again, and our kids were definitely ready. And this is what I love about the stories of our lives and how that's what we're made of. As much as blood cells and muscle and all our physical attributes, what we're really made of is stories.
Absolutely.
And we kind of felt ready for a new one. And
a new chapter.
Oh my God. And then we bring in this new dog, and it's the way I describe it now, so we had these pretty tough dogs that I described as gangsters, gunmen, soldiers. They lived and frightened together like a 2-dog mafia. But they also had the flip side was great discipline and beauty and light. It was just sort of like where something went wrong, they went wrong big. And,
they did. I'm thinking of a high-octane possum event, shall we call it?
A dog uses every muscle in a fight. And this is the other thing. When you're a problem dog owner, you meet all the other problem dog owners before the sun comes up. We hide our beasts.
Or in the rain.
In the rain, yeah. It's torrential rain. I'm taking the dogs out because no one else will be out there. And so we just had these great moments, but also, there was a possum incident where Reuben, our first dog, got hold of a possum, and just when I got him off, Archie, his understudy or first lieutenant, that's when he hits him. And it's like, I describe it as a barbaric yelp. I always remember that line from the Whitman poem, but also then from Dead Poets Society. Yeah. It was like a barbaric yelp meeting a banshee is what that sounded like. And just having these huge moments and then sort of dissecting it a little bit. But I never wanted to lecture in this book. I mean, I'm in no position to. But I never wanted to come across as any kind of expert or to then sort of talk about big moral dilemmas. But I wanted to point to all of these moments and also decisions we've made where you've got a dog that you love and you're an animal lover, but then we would ask ourselves, well, how many animals die in our dog's lifetime to keep that dog alive? And is a terrible moment where your dogs kill a possum and you see the light go out of the possum's eyes after you've got the dogs tied up and you come back and you just see and it was one of the most awful yet beautifully tragic things I've ever seen, as well as carrying your dog into the emergency vet when he's dying. And so I wanted these ideas to be complex in a way that isn't overtly, me trying to impart great knowledge. It's just like, these are some of the things we worry about. And the idea of, your dog's killed a possum, but there'll be some people who go, oh, that's terrible. Oh, you should that. And there'll be other people who just go, well, that's part of life. And that's the natural world unfolding in front of your eyes. Is it only terrible because you've been witness to it?
Yeah.
And we're not witness to that other part where animals are sent to be slaughtered every day so that we can eat them. And so just feeling like you're part of this greater visceral world almost throws you into the wilderness at times. And that's what our dogs did as well. They threw us down into that visceral world, but God, they brought us a lot of love and connection, and that was such an important part of our family unit. And even our new dog, Frosty, who people expect, I think that's the thing, doing certain interviews, people think Frosty's this wild, untamed animal. He's just the friendliest but naughtiest dog we've ever had. And when people ask, is he a rescue? I go, yeah, he's a rescue. And then they go, oh, was he abused? And I say, no, we think he was the abuser. It's like, and he definitely was. He'd been returned to the pound a couple of times, which you only find out. They don't put that in the ad.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite possible you're suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. You love that guy.
Absolutely. But God, he drives me crazy. And that's the other thing too, is just the amount of, we talk about the wilderness of these dogs, but God, there was so much just unadulterated comedy as well.
Yeah.
And where there's nothing like, going to the vet 4 times in one day because of all the things that have happened at home.
Yeah, don't give it away. That's a good scene. I love that one. You can't, you just go, what? No, not again.
And that's, and you get to know your vet really well when you've got 4
we all love Paul.
Animals. Yeah. we think we've contributed very well to our vets.
Yeah, his children, thank you for their education.
Absolutely. But I think I've just realised that, again, people ask me what parts were hard to write, and I just loved all of it. And I loved being there again, and I loved being inside the pages, and I loved just the idea that I'm hanging around with these dogs again. And so I appreciate the awful times as much as the great times. And a rainy day moment where piano teacher comes into your house and they bite the piano teacher. I think of all these different cogs of a lifetime, and then the very same piano teacher comes to the very first event for the book, and then she goes and buys 6 copies the next day. And because at the first talk for this event, everyone was saying to me, because they knew Lindy, the piano teacher, was going to be there, and everyone's going, which one's the piano teacher? Which one's the piano teacher? And then when she bought those 6 copies of the book at my local bookshop, she was at the counter and she went, I'm the piano teacher. And so I just really love that idea that we never quite know how the complexities of a story is actually going to play out.
It'll keep playing out for you, I'm sure, with those characters. Now, I'm a really big fan of audiobooks, Marcus, and I read the first half of the book, and then I decided to download it on Audible and just listen to you reading it. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, you are the only person who could have narrated that book. Don't you think?
I thank you, and I have such trepidation about audiobooks. Like I love audiobooks, and one of my favourite audiobooks is All the Pretty Horses, read by Brad Pitt, and he does it in
I'll have to look it up.
Quite downbeat, but it suits it perfectly. But as the author of a book, we're not actors, and often actors, they just can wring so much out of a sentence that a writer can't. And so I'm so happy that you feel that way about the audio, because I haven't listened to it. I just can't bring myself to listen.
It's great. When you're ready, you have a little listen. You won't be disappointed. I think the first time when I'm pretty sure you're breaking down is in the beach scene, just before they pass. I won't say pass, just before Reuben dies.
Yeah. You've definitely read the book.
Oh, yeah. Just before Reuben dies, there's the 2 of them on the beach, and you get a particularly good photograph of them. But you can hear your voice start to go. And I think it must have been quite a process, because obviously then you lose 2 dogs. You really do lose it a little bit at those times, which for me as a listener, it was beautiful. I was walking and had a little tear, and it was a marvellous immersive experience to have you tell me your story, because it is such a personal story that you're bringing to us.
Yeah. Oh, and thank you. And it is. And even hearing you talk about that, and then I immediately get taken back to that reel in my mind where I see Ruben and my daughter Kitty, just their knees coming out of the water as they're sprinting in and out of the water on the beach, and then having that post-revelation of they were saying goodbye to each other and they didn't even know it. But how good a thing is it for us to have tragic beauty in our lives. And
I think it's everything.
Yeah, it makes so many things worth it, and that's something glorious, because you're bringing those two opposites together. And it is like when your dog has collapsed on the floor in your office at 3 a.m. and you have to wake your kids because you think he's going to die, and there's just that almost inaudible intake of breath before a child cries. And then later on you go, God, I was lucky to witness that.
Yeah. You also narrated the book Thief and Bridge of Clay. How does that work? Is someone coaching you? Is there a producer that's saying, do that again, or we didn't hear that word clearly? How does it work?
Yeah, I think I sort of regretted reading Bridge of Clay in that, but it was a great way to say goodbye to that book after 13 years of working on it.
Yeah.
But also, I kind of think an actor would have done a better job of that, and I was just wrecked anyway. But with this book, it was just the idea of, as you said, it's so intimate to you. You know when to break, or you won't even know; it'll just happen. I did the reading at the studio at Pan Macmillan in Sydney, and everyone was just relieved that I could get through parts without making mistakes. Where they go, "Oh, this isn't going to take 2 weeks; it's going to take 3 or 4 days."
It did. Is that how long it took you to do that one?
It took about 3 or 4 days.
Well done. That's surprisingly short amount of time.
I generally pride myself on, by the time a book comes out, I could pretty much recite the whole book anyway.
Yep.
And so if I'm making mistakes, there's something wrong. And so the hardest thing is slowing down and then finding a place somewhere between totally monotonous and utterly shrill. And so you're trying to... It's such a weird...
And breathing, I imagine. You've got to remember to breathe.
Yeah.
And where am I going to pause to breathe?
Yeah. And so you're trying not to make mistakes. You're trying to breathe. You're trying not to sit there like in a state of like you walk out as if you've done it. It's such an... I'm not going to say ordeal. I just want to say it's quite an unusually interesting ordeal that you go through when you're reading your book, and you get into a certain position, and I kind of have my hands like I'm almost conducting myself to try to get the best out of what I'm doing. So I'm glad that the audio has held up.
In this book, you say, I love movies because I get to see the characters. I love books because I become the characters. So I'd love to know, what characters are you inhabiting at the moment, i.e. what books are you reading at the moment?
One of the best things about being in more bookshops is I end up buying heaps of books and
not necessarily reading them, but just buying them.
Well, it is one of the great pleasures. Some people buy clothes, I buy books, and then you buy a book bag. I was in the Dimmicks shop in Melbourne on Collins Street, and there were these two young people working there, and they recommended Cairo by Chris Womersley.
Okay.
And so I've started reading that, and it reminds me so far of like a modern day My Brother Jack.
Excellent.
And so I've also been reading Demon Copperhead. I usually read a couple of books at once. I'm often reading a bigger book and a smaller book.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of in the middle of both of those books.
And there's a memorable scene in The Three Wild Dogs and the Truth where Archie destroys one of your favourite books. I think it's called Barbarian Days by William Finnegan. And are there any books that you particularly treasure that you go back and reread from time to time?
Oh, all the time. And that was always the thing with Archer. It's sort of like if he was going to chew a book, it's not just going to be any book. No. It's going to be your favourite book. He just had a
He's going to chew it good.
Exactly. And so... one of my favourite books is What's Eating Gilbert Grape, and I love the film. And then it's one of those ones where I saw the movie first, and the book wasn't easy to get at that time.
Yep.
It's like you're looking back at the 1990s where you couldn't just get everything.
No, funny that.
Yeah.
Was it DiCaprio who was in...
Yeah, it was one of his first movies. And Johnny Depp and Juliette Lewis and Mary Steenburgen. And even just me rattling off those names that are in that movie is where people say to be a writer, you've got to read everything and you got to just read it. You read a huge variety. And I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I sort of feel like you can love narrowly as well. And so for me, loving a book and a movie like What's Eating Gilbert Grape is I then love it forensically. I can tell you about this character or that line, or it's sort of like being able to recite in The Catcher in the Rye of the beginning lines, or and all that David Copperfield kind of crap, that he mentions. But my parents would have 2 hemorrhages apiece if I told them anything personal about them, and so even just being able to talk about these things, that's how I've learned to become a writer, by loving things very closely and intensely and having a memory for them, and then going, how do I learn to do that? Also, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay is the way I just say to people, it's a long title.
Yeah.
So Michael Chabon, that's one of his great books, and it won the Pulitzer. So back in early 2000s. So that's a way to look that one up.
Yeah, I will. I'll have to look that one up. Well, I have to say that this book, Three Wild Dogs and the Truth, is a love story. I think it's a love story to your wolf pack, and I think your wolf pack includes 3 dogs, 2 cats, your wife, your children, and a beautiful community around you. You're so lucky to have had that beautiful community, and I just want to share my thanks and that of all your readers to say thank you for sharing with us something that is so close to your heart. We appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. And as I often say, don't judge me too harshly out there. And where there were some wild times, but there were great times. And that's not a bad epitaph if it comes to it.
Indeed. Markus Zusak, what a sweet man. I like what he said about loving certain books forensically and how knowing certain books inside out has informed his writing process. I enjoyed so much of my chat with him.
Okay, well, now to Little Women, the 19th century novel by Louisa May Alcott. And as I was saying before, it is a story that has stood the test of time, given that it's still being published and turned into films and series. But does it stand up to a modern critique? I spoke to our reviewers, Associate Professors Kylie Cardell and Lisa Bennett from Flinders University, and Kylie revisited the story of the March family.
There are 4 sisters. The oldest is Meg. There's Jo, Beth and Amy. And they are living at home with Mama, Mamie, do they call her? Marmee, and a servant. And away at the war is the father of the family. So this is a family who have been separated because of the civil war that's going on, but it's a very heroic kind of noble sacrifice that they've made. The men are off at war, the women are at home, and the book opens on a very cosy domestic world when we meet these 4 sisters who are, they're feisty, they squabble, they feel very authentic and the love feels real, but there's also tension between them. So a domestic idyll, daily little sort of things. Christmas is coming, it's a Christmas story.
And father who writes from the front. Wants them to be his little women. So it is all about girl stuff. It's about girls and ambition and domesticity and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and the ideal woman, right? Like who waits stoically, but busily and not idly for the men to do their job.
But it had a lot more than that going for it, because it's a story that's stood the test of time. It's never been out of print, and it has inspired so many girls over the years in different ways.
And so many adaptations. I think, for me growing up in the 90s and 80s, I cannot not think of the Winona Ryder Jo character, which was a very kind of defining representation of that character. And I think it's very faithful to Alcott, but it was also a very 90s girlhood idea.
In its day, it must have shocked and surprised people and inspired them in some way. What was it?
I don't know if it shocked them. I think it was extremely popular. And there is a good backstory here, because Louisa May Alcott was the financial sort of breadwinner in her family. And so she wrote the book on the advice of the publisher. She did not want to write this book. And her publisher said, I've got an idea and I think you should write this. She had written, I think, several novels at this point. They had done okay. They hadn't done very well. And the publisher says, write this story. I know you can do it.
And her reaction was, she called it moral pap for the young.
She did. She was quite scathing. She drew on her own life. So she had three sisters of her own, so she sort of could draw on that relationship to make the characters feel authentic. But she was pretty scathing about the book and really was surprised that people enjoyed it and really didn't think it would be a success, and apparently was quite mortified by the book for a very long time, which I think is, you know, a kind of surprising story considering how popular, and it's certainly her most popular book of all, and she wrote quite a lot.
So the character of Jo is, I think, probably you could say the most appealing to young women who until that time had been so repressed, because she's feisty, she doesn't believe in marriage. She's a real career girl from the age which she is at the time, which is about 14, I think, in the book.
Yeah, she's the tomboy. She's the one who cuts
cipher
her hair.
for Louisa May Alcott. She is the Jo character, you know. So I think that I read in sort of context that was her way of inserting herself into the story and having her personality, and Jo's ambition and to be a writer, and, you know, shucking off all of the things that a little woman should really want to do until the end, obviously, because of course happily ever after. But I think that was a way of Alcott really engaging with the story. But it does mean that Jo is probably for many people the standout character. She's got such life, such personality. Meg does the right thing for the older sister to do, and she gets married off, and oh, God forbid, you know, I didn't make dinner for my husband on time and now he's mad at me, you know, kind of storyline. But Jo's like, no, I'm not down with that. I'm going to write my plays. I'm going to secretly write stories. I'm going to write these sensational kind of romance tales, all the sorts of things that you just would find thrilling no matter what age and what period you're reading this story. And then, of course, there's Beth, who's just too angelic to live, literally. And who's the other one? Oh, my God.
Amy. Amy, who's a bit tricky.
She's a little bit more interesting because she's a bit feisty too. But I feel like it also, the popularity depends on when you read this book in your life. I know we've talked about Anne of Green Gables on this podcast before and how much we love it. And I think encountering that story when you're young, you really tap into that saccharine sweetness without thinking it's saccharine, you know, the coziness, the feeling of safety in this kind of house. You get that from Little Women as well. I read this for the first time this year, so I came to it with a different perspective, and I just found a lot of it quite moralizing, and all of the criticisms Alcott had of it herself, I went, yeah, that's because they're there. So I loved that kind of cozy cottagecore vibe about being, you know, almost snowed in this lovely home, which, you know, they're meant to be kind of destitute while the father is away. They're reduced to only one servant. It's that kind of Jane Austen destitution where it's like, oh God, we only can have one ball this year. You know, so I kind of like that they still are fine. They're not paupers. They're not, you know, struggling to eat. They're still quite comfortable, and they're doing the best that they can.
And there's a heavy moral Pilgrim's Progress. It has been called like a female version of Pilgrim's Progress. That if you're really good and do the right thing, the mother gets them to go down to the cellar and put their burden on their back, which is just rolled up newspapers and things, and move their way to the top of the house to symbolise that progress.
I feel like for modern readers, or for many modern readers, because I can't speak for everybody, it feels like the narrative's clipping along and you're really liking the characters and they're having these sweet little adventures, you know, in their neighborhood. And then at the end of almost every chapter, it grinds to a halt so that Mammy can, you know, give them a little bit of a sermon about how women should behave, and, oh, I'm sorry you feel this way, but also this is your place. And I found that galling every time it happened, and I wish that those parts could just get cut out so that we could just continue on with the girls having young girl adventures until Dad comes home. So I think that really stuck in my craw while I was reading it, and I think maybe some people these days would find consolation or something, again, cozy and lovely about those parts, but I found them hard to
But I guess
swallow.
most of the adaptations, film and TV, they don't linger on the moral of the story in the way that the novel actually does. And so I guess that's how most people would encounter this text these days. I think very few people would have read the classic version.
One of the things that struck me about it was the detail, the domestic detail. And it reminded me of, you know, the huge popularity of romance novels now, which also dwell on detail, on the little things in the kitchen and in the lounge. and that sense of being, cosy and doing stuff, and very, very girly indeed.
But it also gives us that sense of world building, the historical moment. The war is mentioned, but it isn't really interfering with their domestic space. So it makes you feel almost like you're time traveling a little bit. You get to see what would they have done, and what did they give each other for Christmas, and what did they make for each other. And, you know, they are quite well off, even though they're theoretically not. But even so, the gifts are heartfelt and things that are handmade, and all of that adds another level of feeling like, oh, we're back in time. You know, they can't just go out to the shop and buy things. And yes, the girls all get a religious tract for Christmas, which they're very apparently so happy to get that they sit and read it on Christmas Day. So, you know, they're all a little bit unrealistic, but that's what good fantasy kind of writing is about, that escapist of looking at a family that's happy despite hard circumstances, that loves each other, that have squabbles and things, but then come back together. So, you know, I don't mind a good saccharine story when you get that sense of like comfort from the way that people are acting. I can suspend my disbelief about
and that
the
is a
fact that they're
beautiful
real.
part of the story.
Yeah.
The relationship between the sisters, and the squabbles and the fights and the jealousies and the tensions and the love, which is just a very beautiful picture of family life, and extremely, I think, relatable to most people.
Or not even aspirational,
Aspirational.
Because I would say
True.
probably most people in any reality would not have that kind of picture perfect family, you know, where everyone adores their parents and, oh, it's so wonderful. And even, oh, I'm so sad my sister was mad. Like, all of it is just so far-fetched. But I think that kind of aspiration of the perfect nuclear family is something that really resonates, that people really want and probably don't have like that.
It's a comfort thing, isn't it? And yet Louisa Alcott herself was quite a rebel and wrote all sorts of pot-boiling stories.
And remained unmarried her whole life.
She's Joe.
And, you know, very determinedly remained unmarried. So.
And came from an interesting past where her father had run what was almost a sect in those days.
I think also they were abolitionists and had sort of supported slaves escaping from the South. And so, quite a political and activist background.
And quite involved in the literary community as well. I found it really interesting placing her historically alongside other writers. They were friends with Nathaniel Hawthorne, you know, that kind of thing. So then looking back at the fact that she had written so many books, I went, this makes more sense. This is part of your real world, that you're amongst some of the giants of American literature.
And she probably hates being remembered for Little Women.
Probably.
She's probably turning in her grave.
Think so. The sect actually reminded me, it was like almost like a cult. Like, I think, didn't they like live on organic foods? And I think she at some point recorded that she often felt very hungry. They had to do manual labor. Yeah.
But the house in Little Women is a replica of the house that they lived in, this little farmhouse, which isn't little, but, you know, that kind of idea where a lot of that was transported into the fictionalized version of this story. It was really fascinating, actually. I love reading around the book as well and finding out more about how Alcott was inspired in the hatreds.
It's such an interesting, you know, we love the myth of the inspired writer who just writes, but you know, writers are clever, and you can come up with a story that's seductive and popular. And here's an example. You know, it's not always the muse speaking. Sometimes there is just a very good deal of excellent craft involved, and a determination to tell a particular story, which I think is very good to know.
And then she still has to toe the line, bringing Jo back into the kind of family fold. She's achieving success as a writer. She's selling her stories. And you think, oh, my God, is she going to go off and be a famous writer? No. She gets married and
runs a lovely school for boys. Which I began reading Little Men today.
Oh, you did?
And, you know, it's heartwarming. It gets you in.
Oh.
There's this dear little homeless boy who arrives and everybody's happy, everybody's playing, they're all having a great time. It's very sweet, a very sweet story. But it would be great to talk to Louisa Alcott herself about what she thought about it all, because and also she's judged by the standards of our time occasionally when you read through like Greta Gerwig's film a few years ago. A couple of things have come out of that. One is that men still don't like it much and it doesn't win many prizes. Stories of female domesticity. And the other thing is that there was a kind of move to judge it by today's standards and say, well, where was the slavery? This was 1868 in America. There were all sorts of horrible things going on. She's managed to skip over that pretty well.
Yeah, it's interesting when they have the one servant in their home, but other than that, you don't see when Jo goes out, to see the nanny and all those sorts of things. You don't see the reality. So even though I said you feel like you're time traveling in a fantasy version of this kind of whitewashed world where things are sanitized and clean and lovely, and any sort of conflict gets quickly resolved. And so the realities of the war, I think she tries to write them from the father's perspective, or the boy whose name I've forgotten, who's over there. Laurie. So you get a sense that, it was hard for the men. But again, what it's all about isn't really ever touched on, and how society functions around this isn't really there at all.
It works to serve the myth of the noble sacrifice that's made, right? So yeah, the what's happening is less important than the fact that we're nobly, stoically keeping the home fires burning, which is an extremely powerful nationalistic kind of myth for women.
When I think of Little Women, I picture it like a pretty little snow globe. And they're living in this beautiful little bubble with the snow falling around, and everything else is beyond the globe. And so I think that that's probably a big part of the appeal, where it does feel safe and pretty and comforting, and horrible things like slavery, they don't happen in this nice little pristine bubble.
And it was meant to be a book for girls. So I guess maybe there's a degree of patronisation. But, sometimes people still, a lot of children's literature will aim at that end of the spectrum, right? Like the difficult things are off stage. Let's focus on this kind of lovely.
Do you think, though, that over the years it's been reinvented, new incarnations of it have come out? Has it got something to offer over the so many years that it still remains so popular? Has it changed? Has it got a message for modern women, or is it just put it in the romance category?
I think it does. It is a lovely book to read, but I do think that, like Lisa, I found reading over the obvious didactic moralising just not to my taste, and I think that's a modern readership issue. And it is interesting to me that adaptations of this book tend to really skip over those. They focus on the events, and there's a huge philosophical moral framework in this book that is made very clear at multiple points, that the text has that adaptations don't. So yeah, maybe readers could give it a go, but I'm not sure if they'll find it to their tastes.
Women in the home is something that's been used politically over the years too. So apparently during the Great Depression they constantly had stage versions of this.
Oh, wow.
So it has had its uses, it would seem.
Well, I don't know, with the resurgence of the trad wife on Instagram, maybe the book will make a comeback. I don't know.
I was thinking that too, with the kind of cottagecore popularity of but again, it's a fantasy version of the bubble of existence where things are clean and tidy and you can go out to your backyard and pluck perfect vegetables.
There's always a rich aunt or a rich neighbour, just in case things get too hard.
So I think that this will speak to a wide group of people that want to have that sort of escapism. But they need to swallow the moralizing at the same time, which is a bit harder.
So yes, from both of you, let's hear the love or hate
Can I say
summary.
So having only read this as a grown-up who does not like being talked down to and doesn't like being told where I should be in life, I was mentally punching the book in the face more than enjoying it. So I did not love it.
I don't think it dates well. It's a classic, and it is definitely a classic book. But yeah, the tone of the book is, I don't think Louisa May Alcott's heart was necessarily in the sentiment she portrayed so well. But it does talk down to women, and it paints a pretty limited picture of women's subjectivity and agency, and that can be hard to take.
The snow globe.
The snow globe is beautiful to look at, but
beautiful.
You don't want to be in it.
No, I don't.
Louisa May Alcott's 19th century classic Little Women, not quite making the grade in a modern woman's reading list, according to our regular reviewers, Kylie, Cardell and Lisa Bennett. They're both associate professors in creative writing at Flinders University.
This is Sundoku, the podcast for people who know a bookcase can fit into all manner of small spaces.
I'm Madeline. I'm 37. The first books that I think got me hooked on reading were like Australian girl-focused youth fiction, so Margaret Clark, and then Puberty Blues, strangely. Yeah, beach, kind of Australian beach youth fiction. One book that definitely grabbed my attention as a teenager was The Handmaid's Tale, and I think set me on a path of loving kind of dystopia, future, bit of sci-fi books that hasn't really died. The Handmaid's Tale also sort of was the first time where I got really stuck on an author and just wanted to read everything that they'd written. So going, to some of Margaret Atwood's first books, all the way to sort of her more recent eco-dystopia trilogies like Oryx and Crake and Mad Adam, I think was the last one. When I walk into a bookshop, I tend to look at the new arrivals and whatever the front cover artwork that sort of grabs my attention. I actually just love a secondhand bookshop, a good secondhand bookshop where the person who's working there knows where everything is and has an encyclopedic knowledge of everything that's ever been printed. So my current sundoku is Teetering. Got a couple of the First Knowledges series, about design and plants and astronomy, which are such great reads, and then a healthy amount of fiction as well. I'm going through a bit of a Helen Garner phase, and picked up at the market on the weekend The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which I can't wait to read.
And it's so great to hear what everyone's reading. What about you, Michaela? Any gems by your bed?
I don't know if it's a gem yet or not. It's actually our book club book. It's called Want by Gillian Anderson. It's a collection of hundreds of women's sexual fantasies, and a few in the book club have read it. One said she read it twice, so I don't know what's going on there. One of the others said they got to the third fantasy and gave up. They found it really stupid and boring. So I don't know whether I'm going to land somewhere in the middle. Who knows? That's what's on my bedside table. What about you, Annie?
Well, that's interesting. It's a big topic at the moment. Women coming out with, their genuine selves and what they want out of life. And in the last episode, we talked about On All Fours by Miranda July,
yes.
Which is, wow, what a book. I read that.
You loved it.
Handed it on to a number of eager people because I'd talked about it so much. Amazing book, very interesting.
Yeah. Sarah obviously enjoyed it too, and she was discussing it. And Rachel Yonder's Night Bitch, that was another one that Sarah discussed.
Might have to check that one out now.
Yeah.
And I have been in Japan for the last few weeks, and I have been reading a book called Butter, a novel of food and murder by Asako Yuzuki.
What a great title. I love that.
And it is about butter, and it's about food, and it is about murder. So
I presume they weren't killed with the butter knife.
No, much more subtle than that. Very dense book, really, but if you love food, my God, you'll get off on this.
Oh, brilliant. Sounds good.
So, yes, I haven't quite finished that yet, so I'll give you a full resume of it when I get to the end of it.
Brilliant. And with that recommendation, we sign off. Hope some of today's books and authors have piqued your interest. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. Happy reading and catch you next time.